Welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is Lean in Olympia. This is a live bi-weekly show airing on the second and fourth Tuesdays of the month from Interfaith Works. Lean in Olympia is a show that features conversations at the crossroads of humanity, justice, and belief. My name is Corey Passons. I'm the program manager for Interfaith Relations and Interfaith Works. We are a social justice and peace nonprofit based in Olympia, Washington. Our mission is social justice and peace through interfaith understanding and cooperation. Today, we are very privileged to welcome two guests with us, the Reverend Kyllo and Aneelah Afzali. And this is some bio information from them. Anila is the executive director of the American Muslim Empowerment Network. She's also a board member of the Faith Action Network, Washington for Black Lives, and Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Anila left her legal career in 2013 to serve as a community activist and interfaith leader. Since then, she has worked on building bridges of understanding and unity to advocate for justice. Anila was named one of the most influential people by Seattle Magazine in 2017 and has received numerous awards and commendations for her tireless work in creating peace and interfaith understanding. Anila, welcome.
Thank you so much, Corey, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great to be here with you. Reverend Kyllo is a Lutheran pastor serving as executive director of Paths to Understanding. He is the founder of Neighbors in Faith, answering Islamophobia by building up beloved community. Neighbors in Faith is now a program of Paths to Understanding, which is the organization that we will talk about today. Terry has learned that when we forget how to recognize other humans, we lose part of our own humanity, and believes that we have to work together to live in this way of beloved community. Terry's leadership has been recognized by the Faith Action Network, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, and the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Corey. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to be here, both of you. And I do want to talk about your organization today. I want to talk about this work of interfaith understanding, cooperation, building beloved community. I also wanted to take a couple of minutes just to get to know each of you. As I've found and as I've been mentored in my own interfaith development, our stories bind us together in ways that theologies, methodologies pale in comparison to be as effective. So I was just wondering if I could ask each of you what you might name as one thing, maybe the one thing that you celebrate the most about your own tradition. And then after that, if you could name one misperception about your tradition that you would, if you could just wave a wand and correct that misperception, the world might be a better place. So one thing to celebrate and one thing that you wish people knew that might be a little bit misaligned with how you understand your tradition. And Aneelah, can I invite you to go first?
Sure. This is completely off the cuff for everybody listening. So I apologize in advance if it's not
good.
Out there
That's great.
But thank you for the questions. I think there's so many different things that I cherish from my faith tradition. But if I had to pick one that might be a little bit unique, is the very direct daily connection to the faith in the sense of our daily prayers. And even like something like wearing the hijab is supposed to be a reminder, a sort of direct connection and reminder of God to me and my ability to connect to a higher power. So that sort of ability to bring in the divine into the mundane on a moment by moment, daily level. I think that's something that I absolutely cherish about my faith tradition, among so many other things, but maybe that's the one that I'll highlight. And then in terms of misconceptions, again, there's so many that I could potentially point to, but if it's okay, Corey, I'll pick two, because these are the two areas that the anti-Muslim industry has been very effective in promoting anti-Muslim sentiment really sort of circles around 2 points. One of them has to do with women's rights. So I wish more people understood how empowering and liberating Islam has been and is for millions upon millions of Muslim women around the world, number one. And then number two has to do with Islamic teachings about peace and unity and solidarity when there's so much misinformation and intentional propaganda promoting a narrative of sort of violence or fear or any kind of sort of negativity. So those are the two areas of misconception, and we can delve further into them. But I would just highlight those two misconceptions that I wish with a snap of a finger I could potentially change.
Yeah, thank you for both of those aspects of your reflection. I think we will have time to probably circle back to both of those elements that you mentioned. So thank you for starting that off. How about you, Reverend Terry?
Well, so the thing I love the most about Lutheran Christianity is this understanding that just as God heard the cries of the people of Israel in slavery, as God knew their suffering and moved to address the injustice of their situation, that in the Christian tradition, that God became a human being to address the unjust situation of Roman occupation. So God has the compassion and the courage to suffer with and for human beings when we're part of a larger system that is doing harm to us. And thus is the call then for us to join with each other and to center on others when injustice is happening to them. The thing about the Lutheran tradition that is a misconception, I mean, I'm not sure it's a misconception. I think we're often too passive. I think that a Lutheran tradition grew out of kind of an educational, kind of a university setting with Martin Luther. And I think that there are times when my community gets too focused on education and public statements and not enough, on the kind of action that I think we see in the faith leaders of all of the Abrahamic traditions, who are willing not only to think and to pray, but we're willing to act as well.
Wonderful. Well, I have a little bonus question in this getting to know you time of our conversation today that I wanted to offer. The theologian Kirsten Stendhal is the person who's I guess given the benefit of being coined the phrase holy envy. And this is a way to name an attribute of a tradition that's not your own that you want to celebrate or to bring forth. For example, when I look at the religion of Buddhism, I'm not a Buddhist, but I really have a holy envy and a deep kind of a respect and love for how that religion centralizes practice. The practice of sitting, the practice of meditation as a foundational aspect is not just it's not a cerebral religion, it's a practice experience. I really value that, and I have a sense of holy envy about that. So I wanted to just give each of you an opportunity to name a holy envy for the religion of the other.
Well, I think I'll go first this time. So I really, and very similar to your comments around Buddhism, I very much appreciate the physicality and the simplicity and the clarity of Islamic teachings in general, but also the faith practice of prayer 5 times a day. Having engaged in some Islamic prayer in community, one of the most practical features of it is that you stand shoulder to shoulder with each other, and everybody is very clearly, trying to create enough space for each other, but also maintain a certain sense of connection to each other as well. And those practices and that deep sensibility that we're all in this together, I think together I'm envious of, because in Christian congregations, we might sit 2 pews away from the next person sometimes, and that's just kind of silly, unless it's a COVID time, of course.
Yeah, social distancing wasn't maybe that big of a deal to some.
Yes, but we did it anyway.
Yeah. And Anila, how about for you?
Yeah, for me, something that really stands out, and even though this is a part of our tradition as well, it's not emphasized as much, I don't think, and that is really that moving forward on the vision of love. like really using love as the driving force, because of the sort of Christians that I know who really put their faith values into practice. Love is really a defining feature that moves them and grounds them in the work that they do. And this is something that, Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, embodied love. And as Muslims, we believe in Jesus, peace be upon him, and his teachings, including his teachings about love. So it is a portion of our faith tradition as well, but I don't think it's emphasized as much as it is in the Christian tradition. And that's something that I do wish we had more in the Muslim community, is really that driving force of love and grounding in love in everything we do, and really using that as a motivating force, like even as the founder of the religion being very much driven by love.
Thank you so much. Thanks to each of you for that. That's really a powerful exercise to take on, and it takes some deep understanding, and it takes authenticity to be able to speak that, kind of holy envy. But it's really powerful to witness a reflection of authentic witnessing from another person outside of your tradition, to be able to name something and celebrate. It can offer a sense of, pride in the healthiest sense, and also mutuality. And I think that sense of mutuality is an element in a kind of dynamic that we are going to talk about with the work that you all do. That's so necessary in interfaith relating. So to those people watching, I want to share a little bit about Paths to Understanding. And we'll be putting some links on our website and YouTube channel as well to this stellar organization. And from your website, from Paths to Understanding website, it says that we foster relationships of respect between wisdom communities. We support and train wisdom communities in multi-faith peacemaking in their neighborhoods for the common good of our children, our planet, and ourselves. Paths to Understanding does this by telling inspiring stories through media, public events, and nurturing relationships. They're supporting existing relationships between wisdom communities and supporting new relationships between wisdom communities. And then the roots of this organization go back to the 1960s, and they run deep in pioneering interfaith movements of the Pacific Northwest. Rabbi Levine, Father Tracy, and Pastor Rolander began the Challenge program on Como TV back in 1960 out of a desire to counter dehumanization. Their vision continued with the formation of Camp Brotherhood, which is an interfaith camp and retreat center near Arlington, Washington, and about 250,000, sorry, help me with this,
250,000.
250,000, yeah, okay, thank you. 250,000 people have engaged in interfaith encounter at the camp over the years. That's beautiful and impressive. So I wanted to turn to some of the work that you're doing now within Paths to Understanding. And maybe before I do, is there anything you'd like to add about the organization before we get into some of the specific inquiries I have about the work you're doing? Something that you want to make sure that people know that I might not have added in that introduction?
Yeah, the only real significant thing is that about 4 or 5 years ago, our organization sold that camp because they realized, like many camps have, that they just couldn't keep up with all the maintenance and do the work of helping to promote interfaith relationships. And so, and then about a year or so ago, they incorporated Neighbors in Faith into that organization, and we're kind of moving forward together with all of that. Based on that sort of key insight of Rabbi Levine years ago, which was that he saw anti-Catholic bigotry on the rise, and he knew what, as a Jewish person, what that could lead to. And then he and Father William Tracy, and then a Protestant pastor who was from the majority religion, essentially Protestant Christianity, was willing to use his status as a prominent Protestant pastor to create space for the Jewish and Catholic voices. And together they were able to get to not only their commonalities, but even the 1960s were able to speak to their differences, which meant that there was a real deep trust on that show that I think really spread outward from there and helped other people to see the same, both the commonalities and the differences. Okay,
thank you for that. Yeah. So I wanted I wanted to pick up on a thread. Terry was a guest of the Interfaith Works Program Council, which is a gathering of delegates from our 30 plus diverse faith communities in Thurston County. And the delegates from these communities gather once a month and do work related to various programs and initiatives. And Terry was our guest last month. And one of the things that we talked about was a deepening culture of polarization that is certainly not just intuited, but it's expressed and writ large, sometimes on the steps of our federal buildings. We can see the outcomes of this increase of polarization. And we also understand that such polarization in political spheres is not confined just to the political realm, but it begins to become a cultural phenomenon that impacts religious freedoms and religious mutuality as well. So Terry, I wanted to, and Anila, I wanted to begin by just seeing if you could paint a picture of how you're interpreting some of the dynamics that are in play right now in our culture that you could define, I guess, loosely as polarization, but when it comes to religious tolerance, can have other names as well. And I wanted to just bring you into the conversation by asking you about that.
So which one do you want to go first there, Corey?
Which person of you?
Yeah.
Well, Terry, why don't you begin, please?
Well, sure. So we have to recognize, I think, and this is part of what I shared with that group that night, is that there's been a lot of research done as to why in the last century, 262 million people were murdered in genocide. And that there's a pretty clear, definable kind of process that takes place that leads a nation to walk that path. And so there's lots of steps, to it. But one of them is that there is a sense of superiority that is closely mingled with a sense of being persecuted. And of course, we have in this country a long history of white supremacy, of Christian white supremacy, and of the creation of a caste system based on the skin color and religion. And so we can see in the last 40 years a tremendous amount of narrative from Rush Limbaugh and lots of other people who've taken that message into every kind of communication channel. This both sense of superiority and a sense of persecution at the same time. And you add to that then some real life challenges. And we see this particularly with wealth and income inequality being on the rise since 1980. And so many folks working harder and harder and not being able to make ends meet. And then you add to that at the same time an increasing awareness of the religious and cultural diversity of the country. And then you add to that one last thing, which is a dehumanization process, in which people begin to essentially dehumanize, to not recognize the humanity of people in certain groups. And when that happens, you keep dividing and dividing and dividing people into smaller and smaller bits, and you increase the temperature to the point at which people feel it's justified and even right to engage in violence and to engage in violence for political ends. And that's what we saw on January 6th. And Anila and I have been, when we first met for coffee, we're concerned about this very topic. The first time we met at Pete's Coffee in Redmond, we were concerned about the tone and the kind of dehumanization that's happening, not only with respect to people of different religious traditions, but people of different political philosophies. So the last thing I'll say is we have to recognize that much of the messaging on talk radio, in social media, by politicians on the air, in newspapers, it isn't just hard-edged politics. It's actually been sowing the seeds of dehumanization based on over 400 years of Christian white supremacy. And we have to understand where that is leading us into a more violent society and not a more peaceful one.
Yeah. if you're preaching it, I would be saying amen. And I think you are too. So yes. Aneelah, how do you, what's your response to this, to where Terry was going with that and the prompts that I had?
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe dear brother Terry did a great job sort of laying out the larger framework around what we're seeing happening in our country and this growing divisiveness. It's actually one of the reasons that I personally decided to do the work that I'm doing, is because I saw exactly what Terry's talking about, this growing divisiveness in our country that was really tearing us apart from within. And I could see that it was only going to get worse. And the consequences of that we've seen throughout history are so negative, so dehumanizing, and ultimately result in the kind of atrocities of genocide and more. So I knew I had to and wanted to be at the forefront working on some of these issues. And the only sort of few things that I'll add to what Terry already very comprehensively laid out is that we have in our country, we have had this history of sort of white supremacy and racism, and we never as a country repented for that kind of sin or that kind of ongoing racism. And most people don't even fully understand how those sins from the past, how the sort of racial hierarchy from the past continues to live on today, and the kind of impact it continues to have today. So that's sort of one thing, is we never actually had reparations or reconciliation or the kind of repairing of harm and leading to healing that we absolutely need. So that's one piece. Another piece is that throughout history, this approach of divide and conquer has been used effectively by politicians and others for a sort of political purpose or profit motive. And we're seeing that happen again today, where we're seeing intentional messaging that creates divisiveness for the sort of gain of some folks that actually hurts all of us as Americans, as we the people. So that this is a continuation of that approach of divide and conquer that has been detrimental but effective, unfortunately, throughout history. Of course, the other pieces that Terry mentioned, the changing demographics, the very real economic issues. I would also add some of the very personal issues that people are facing, even at a time of social media where we are more virtually connected. We are very disconnected sort of on emotional and personal levels with each other. So some people even call social media anti-social media. Because we see sort of the consequences of that. And it leads to a very real sense of loneliness and sort of a lot of negative emotional, personal issues that add to the problem we are sort of facing and seeing. And that gets magnified in that kind of way. And then when you add to this mix two other realities, one is an intentional propaganda effort, again, for profit, for political purposes, but an actual effort. And I'm not just talking about from other countries, propaganda efforts, but I'm talking about in our own country, where there is this machinery or industry of anti-Muslim messaging, for instance, among others. But I think the anti-Muslim propaganda machinery has been one of the most effective that we've seen. And this is something that I've been saying for a long time now, is that kind of effort does not just hurt Muslims. It hurts all of us as Americans. And we are seeing, again, the consequences of that kind of propaganda effort moving forward and not being challenged enough, that now it's sort of affected other parts of our country and society as well. And it's created this situation where people are living in different realities, or at least they have sort of different facts that they are reaching conclusions on. So it's hard to even talk to some people who come from a different sort of worldview, because they have a different set of facts that they are relying on. So it's not just different conclusions reached, it's absolutely different facts that they're looking at, different information that they are being fed. And the way social media and sort of our technology giants have created it with algorithms and everything else is people are getting their confirmation, they're getting confirmation of their own biases. So they're being further led into sort of inwardly within their own perspectives, as opposed to having the kind of bridge building, the kind of connection across different perspectives that is so necessary for us to live in a more humane way, and it really in a sort of effective way for our country to move forward as a country and as a people.
I so appreciate that last point, that over time there is an accumulation of disparity between how people understand their reality, to the point where we can have conclusions that are just seemingly day and night. And so one thing that's been of interest to me is to try to step back and figure out, how do we gain perspective? How do we look outside of our own reality? And you both have mentioned history in one way or another. I've been reflecting on the wonderful book by Chris Hedges, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, where he looks at some of the ways that, for example, in Yugoslavia, and some of the ways that the intentional polarization that was used in that region. I'm wondering, where do you two look in terms of historical examples to try to gain some kind of clarity or perspective on where we are on this meter of perhaps threat or peril in our culture? You know, where expressions like the January 6th insurrection, where we might as a country suffer something that, but writ large. Where do you look for perspective in this time outside of disparate, differing news outlets and media, particularly with regards to history? How would you respond to that, Terry?
Well, so about 5 years ago, I met with Anila, other leaders, interfaith leaders in the state, at a temple to Hirsch Sinai in Seattle. And, as we're sitting around having a few lunch bites with each other, the conversation turned to this question. Mm-hmm. Is this 1936 Germany? Is it 1931? Was it 1928? Where are we at? Just the comparison itself is enough to give one chills. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think we kind of don't know right now. I mean, if we're looking already at insurrections, if we're looking already at political parties choosing to not validate democratic processes, mm-hmm. Yeah. Then we're already pretty far along on that path. If we have, let's say, 60, 70% of the Republican Party members across the country not believing the last election was free and fair, despite not having any evidence to back up their claim, we are pretty far along in terms of the degradation of our democratic processes. And we can see, I think, that there are some who want to throw away, essentially, those democratic processes so they can win by minority rule. And they're willing to do that in any way that they possibly can. So we are at the precipice. I think we're at a fulcrum moment right now. And I am not one that says, well, a certain president won the last election, therefore we're good to go. We should put down our tools. This is actually the moment when we need to press harder to make sure that every vote counts and that everyone can vote.
And just to reorient our conversation and your response toward a religious framework too, in every historical example that we might cite, including our current national emerging crisis of polarization, religion is always used by the forces that would seek to benefit from such disparities. Religion is always used as a factor that has capabilities of spreading us apart, which is such a paradox in the beautiful religions of the world and the wisdom tradition. So Anila, how do you, as you hear me say that and hear Terry talk about some of the examples from history, how do you hold those together? How do you respond to that?
What I've also learned in my personal experience is how powerful it is when faith leaders, from different communities, from different traditions, come together and stand united with one moral voice to share a perspective on different justice issues of our day. I remember specifically at a DACA rally where I was up there speaking and I had different faith leaders from all traditions standing with me. And as I'm speaking to the crowd, I was noticing that people were wiping away tears. Mm-hmm. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me because we had emotional speakers before me, including specifically directly impacted DACA recipients and others. And I could understand people sort of having tears and crying then. But I was a little bit surprised as to why they were sort of wiping away tears as I was speaking from sort of a faith perspective. And afterwards, when I talked to some people, including people who were atheist or agnostic and didn't necessarily subscribe to a faith tradition, what I learned from them is that to them, that symbol, that imagery of faith leaders from different traditions, decked out in their religious garb, standing together with a united moral voice on this issue, that was so powerful to them, and that they were hungry for that they had not seen enough of that powerful imagery is what really moved them literally to tears. So I know exactly how powerful faith communities and faith leaders can be in these moments of trial and tribulation. And that's why we need to see more faith leaders and other community leaders stepping up and speaking in this kind of, multi-faith or interfaith way, rather than just hearing it from one community or one faith tradition's perspective. That diversity and unity on the message is so powerful to the community, and we need to see and hear a lot more of that.
We do. Yeah, I think there's just a felt instinct to appreciate seeing the visual display of that, of the religious symbols coming together through the personhoods of leadership. It's very powerful, and yes, we need more of it in the public square. Sometimes, in my work in doing ecumenical and interfaith dialogue in the seminary, I would see a lot of professional theologians coming together to share, concepts and ideas, but religion is played out in the home and in the public square and through the leadership of community, and to see that kind of displays of unity is very powerful. And it's something that you all are doing and fostering that I celebrate in your work. And so earlier in our conversation, we started to contextualize that we are, whether we like it or not, we are in an emerging dynamic of polarization. We spent a little bit of time understanding that and unpacking that. And Aneelah, your comments are helping us segue into what do we do? We are not passive to allowing this to swell and become its own reality. We can, as people from the wisdom traditions, as people who live and breathe from the inspiration of wisdom traditions and religious faiths and traditions, we can speak out, we can act out, we can make a world. So I'm wanting to turn now to some of the work that you do in your organizations, and also maybe some of your other associations related to interfaith work and dialogue. Let's begin to explore what are some of the ways that we can actually begin to change the tide, to build interfaith relations, to build interfaith cooperation. Maybe you could tell us some of the specific ways that your organization works to accomplish this vision of beloved community or tikkun olam, or building a better world. What are some of the specific ways that you all do that kind of work?
Well, I'll be happy to start. I think there are three ways that we try to do that work. And you read some of that earlier, but there's actually research behind it. So there's so much negative news out there. We're drowning in the negative about each other. We're drowning in narratives about each other, trying to understand each other from people who don't like the group that we're trying to learn from, right? So as Anila always says, it's important to learn about Muslims from Muslims, not from people who hate Muslims, right? So part of the work of Paths to Understanding is doing media. And this is why this kind of program is so important too. We need to create spaces to share positive stories about each other. And because it's like water on a parched land when those stories are shared, either in social media or in other forms of media as well. So first, we want to share those inspiring stories because we need them, because otherwise we just feel like we're all alone. No one's with us. Number two, we need to move from those positive stories and sometimes telling those positive stories around the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? To nurturing relationships. Because the research shows and our personal experience shows that when you get to know someone, not just know about them, but you get to know them, something really begins to shift. And so that's why we need faith communities, wisdom traditions of all kinds, community groups to be getting together as they can, now on Zoom and those kind of things, but later on together, just so we have those positive stories to tell, and we begin to find that we have so much in common, and our differences can inform, not just divide us, right?
Yeah.
But the last one's the really important one. And this is where interfaith work has often failed. And I'm so glad to know that Interfaith Works in Olympia actually has been doing some of this, which is to act for the common good together.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we build a stronger community together, given our differences, but based on our commonalities, all of a sudden we see that the folk that we were kind of not so sure about, they're actually for us, and they're building the community with us, and we're in this together. We're an e pluribus unum in reality, not just on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the three big steps that I think we need to be working on all the time.
Yeah, I think Terry did a very good job, again, sort of setting it all forth. I don't have much to add specifically to those things, but maybe I'll elaborate a little bit on each one of those specific things. One of them is the sort of personal, positive stories and relationships. So to the extent we can do building those personal relationships, that's fantastic. But unfortunately, for some communities like the Muslim community, it's a very small community, relatively speaking. So the American Muslim community in our country is about 1% of the population. So it's very hard for everybody to have a close personal relationship or any personal relationship with their American Muslim neighbors. So that's why the stories are so critical, because short of that actual relationship, stories are the next best thing. And I will also add that there are a lot of people in our country, especially at a divided time, who will never come and talk to somebody who looks like me, or they might never enter a mosque, but they might be willing to talk to somebody who's named John or David or Susan or Karen or Terry or, Corey. So each one of us have that ability. We have our own networks, our own friends and colleagues and family and workmates and others that we can potentially. Everybody can be an ambassador for their individual circles of influence and on their social media. And again, sharing the positive personal stories, because we know that those are the things that actually can change hearts and minds. It's not the facts and stats and data that I have at my disposal. I can argue with somebody about sort of what the Quran says or what it doesn't say, or, all of the information. I have all that at my disposal, but those kinds of facts and statistics and data are not necessarily going to change hearts and minds. What actually changes hearts and minds, according to research, at least initially, facts and stats and data are relevant later, but at least initially, to get through that negative fear or anger or negative emotions, is really to start with those personal stories or personal relationships. So that's why we emphasize that so much. So instead of on social media, somebody sharing an article challenging, let's say, some person's flawed perception of what the Quran states, it'll be far better for them to share a story about this Muslim couple who feeds the homeless, for instance, or, like something like that, like a positive personal story is very, very powerful. The other piece that I would add is, like Terry was saying, turning that into real action on the ground. I would see that in two ways. One is service projects together, because all of our faith and wisdom traditions teach us to serve the other, to help our neighbors. So doing service projects together is a beautiful and powerful way to build those relationships. And then number two, justice advocacy work together as well, for the reasons that we were talking about before, that our moral united voice is very powerful there. And maybe a third piece that I'll add that is also very effective is food, is, bringing people together over food, breaking bread together. And especially if we can share and enjoy sort of multicultural cuisine and enjoy and appreciate the food from different communities, that also is a powerful way to really make an impact. I know it's hard right now with COVID, but hopefully we'll get past that soon. And in the meantime, even finding virtual opportunities to come together and share and celebrate. So those are some of the additional ways that I would sort of throw out there for specific concrete things to do.
This is, we're all feeling, especially as we're moving into like this 12th month of the pandemic, and it is a real time of exacerbated, psychological, spiritual, pain from the kind of distancing that's been going on, and it's very real. And it's also on a pragmatic level, it's very difficult for people like us in organizations that are trying to mobilize, organize, and make connections. It's a very difficult time to do that. your organization and mine, Interfaith Works and Paths to Understanding, is looking to host a seminar online where we will watch a film called American Muslim, highlighting the lives of 5 different Muslims in New York during the Muslim ban. And it highlights the difficulties that this policy placed upon their lives, and it tells their story, and it's such an intimate human documentary. I can't wait for us to organize this and to offer it. It's probably one of the best things we can do in this moment because we're constrained by distancing. So let's pin that as an anticipation and a hope for the coming months. Before the pandemic, could you tell us about some of the specific ways that you enabled people to share stories? I hear you saying share stories, but where and how did people do that through mechanisms that you might have created, or through events that you helped to create? And then when we hear about those, we can maybe look ahead and start to plan and think about, replicating that when we get past the pandemic.
Sure, I'm happy to go first this time and say that before the pandemic, some of the specific ways that we allowed for these opportunities and spaces to develop relationships and gain personal stories had to do with a number of open houses that we did at our mosque, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound. Mm-hmm. So that was one way, and different mosques around town. So that's one way of directly inviting people to the place of worship so they could see for themselves and remove some of that fear and uncertainty and negative emotions that people might have, and for them to experience what Muslims experience in going to a place of worship. And then, of course, always having food to bring people together. We would also have different interfaith events, and during the month of Ramadan in particular, having those opportunities for people to literally break bread together at the time of breaking of the fast. So those are sort of some ways. We also had 2 different programs that I was involved in specifically with Reverend Terry. And one of them was Faith Over Fear. And that was a roadshow event that we did across the state of Washington, where we would go to speak to different communities about building these kinds of relationships with their Muslim community, if they had one, or with other sort of more regional way to address some of these misconceptions, fears, and really build bridges and bring people together, and also to expose the propaganda machinery that's really dividing us. So we did that. And I will say that some of the experiences we had in some of the towns we went to, it was really moving to see and experience even the transformation that some people had just in the 2 hours that we were together for that event. And it was really powerful, especially in places where they had never met, some people had never met a Muslim before in person. And all they knew about Islam or Muslims was what they saw on Fox News, for instance. So that was really powerful. And then another program that we did was called Sharing Our Stories, where we brought people together, and there was some videos that we had created telling the story of 3 different American Muslims. And we used that as a launching board for sharing our own stories, whatever backgrounds we come from, in sort of small roundtables to really get to know each other and build bridges of understanding and unity with some guided questions there as well. I will add one thing before I pass it over to Terry, and that is that some of the programs that I would recommend are continuing online even now. So you mentioned the one you're going to be doing, Corey, which sounds great. We also have our Facts Over Fear program, and it's we're doing it in a webinar format. It's going on right now, actually, and we may do other ones as well. But the point with the Facts Over Fear campaign is really to help address some of the specific myths and misconceptions that are promoted by the anti-Muslim hate industry in really effective messaging ways, and also use that as, again, a springboard to have a conversation around these specific myths and misconceptions. So I highly recommend the Facts Over Fear virtual program for anybody, and they can check out our videos, our 5 animated videos at the Facts Over Fear website. It's factsoverfear.org.
Terry, before you respond, I want to just say that you referenced this tour that was towards some of the more rural parts of, I believe you said it was just Washington State at this point in time. And I think that something that happened in our conversations, we didn't get a chance to celebrate some of those moments that Aneelah just referenced. Like she had mentioned, just in the course of 2 hours, there was a sense of transformation, and that we were focusing on some of the other concerns that are happening in rural America. Could you share maybe about about some of these stories of people who, let's hear about what is it like for someone, describe that event for someone who's never met a Muslim before, and what happened in that space of that change.
Yeah, so I think one of them is, again, just actually having a person, a personal encounter or a personal introduction to somebody, somebody live in person that somebody can see as a fellow human being, as a fellow American, and being able to hear directly from me rather than the warped perspective of who Muslims are, pulling out fringe elements within the Muslim community and identifying them as the norm. That's usually what happens in media or Hollywood. And for them to be able to actually meet a personal Muslim who practices her faith and is able to share about both the faith and what it teaches, but then also how the faith is twisted for propaganda or political profit motives in a way to really sort of promote fear and division. So be able to be exposed to what is happening at that sort of propaganda level, to meet an actual Muslim and hear from them directly, to be able to talk to, hug, shake hands with a Muslim, to be able to have their questions answered, whatever the question may be. And we actually welcome all questions, doesn't matter how bad the question is or any of that stuff, to be able to give them that space for them to address their fears and misconceptions and recognize how wrong some of those fears and misconceptions are with actual, information, both from me as a Muslim, but then also very powerfully from Terry as a Reverend, as a Christian Reverend, and fellow brother who can also attest to sort of what we're speaking about. So that combination, we call ourselves, some people would say the dynamic duo, like having that powerful combination and giving people the space to both air their fears and misconceptions and then properly have them addressed and recognize them for what they were. That's what happened. That I literally have had people come up to me, give me a hug afterwards, after those Faith Over Fear roadshows, and express how they had this fear, this negative energy within themselves, and how they felt it release just in that 2-hour program. In fact, specifically in the first one we did was in Longview, Washington. And I remember that experience in particular, because that was our first one. We didn't know what to expect. People were telling me to wear a bulletproof vest even. Oh boy. No, I'm not going to do any of that. It's my protector. And to have it turn into this beautiful opportunity for transformation that we were able to witness on the ground was just so moving. And it's an experience that I'm able to take, that I will always carry with me as well.
Corey, it's so what I've been trying to do is to use my place unearned within the caste system to create space for Muslim voices. And so and I'm from a small town. I'm from a town of 300 people, and I go back there and visit all the time, and I know what people think and kind of what is needed, to help people move a little bit. And so what I would do is we would kind of pick out some areas across the state, and then I would start contacting local wisdom communities, and they would often return my call because I'm a pastor. And I would go sometimes and do teaching sessions with those churches. Sometimes I couldn't do that, but often I would. And I'd get 10, 15, 20 people to come, and I'd come back with another meeting about 3 or 4 months later and do an event called Love in a Time of Fear. And I'd bring 2 Muslims. We'd have, 3 10-minute speeches basically, and then some Q&A. And then just time for people to meet each other. And then it'd come back in 3, 4, 5 months later and have Aneelah and I come and do Facts Over Fear. And then later on, we might bring, that other event where people have more time to talk to each other. So we're creating kind of ripples in the community over time. But the important thing for me was to use the unearned privilege that I have within this larger society of injustice to create that space. And to try to figure out how can I be supportive in a way that allows them to hear Anila, and when they can't hear her, that they can hopefully hear it from me. I've had people walk up to me and say that they have had fear gripping onto their heart for decades. And the human heart is too important and too precious to allow fear to sit there. And it's through these kinds of experiences that people were able to let that go.
just so grateful for both of you for being so proactive, because in the absence of that proactivity, we've already discussed what other kinds of forces are at play and building ground. And so I hope that when the pandemic releases some of the hold on us, that work can continue. And I personally want to offer whatever support I can and through my organization toward expanding that work. I think it's so important and powerful. I know just in my own life, that which has, transformed and liberated me from many of, my own unreflected upon preconceptions has been direct encounter, direct experience through travel, through the hospitality, and also through my own proactivity of moving toward others to hear their stories. There really is nothing to substitute that. Yeah. So I wanted to begin to wrap up today. And as we do, I wanted to turn toward areas of hope and where each of you might be seeing hope right now. Perhaps it's a story, a specific story, or a trend you're perceiving. But as we begin to conclude, what is something that you would offer right now that is energizing you with the power of hope?
So Corey, I mean, I think groups like Interfaith Works are incredibly hopeful for me because you have a history of gathering people together from different wisdom traditions. You get together and you get to meet people, and you have people engaging each other and getting to know each other in deep ways, and you work together for the common good. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing is when we look over the entire state, we see organizations at various levels of organization, but and kind of programmatic, kind of work. But we see it in Bellingham, mm-hmm. in Everett, of course, all through Seattle and the east side, but on down to Vancouver, Washington. There's one in Longview. There's in Pullman, Washington, Walla Walla, Spokane, the Tri-Cities, Yakima. There's all these communities where they have a long history of doing this work. And part of what we want to do is start to tell those stories better, because people don't necessarily know that all this beautiful stuff's happening all over the place. Mm-hmm. And that there really is, a tremendous bench in terms of people having the skills and abilities and experiences to do it. And that makes me so hopeful.
That's great. Love that.
Yeah, I will say that first off, my faith gives me hope and optimism. It gives me that strength to do the work that I'm doing, but it also gives me so much hope and optimism. And doing the work that I'm doing out there on the ground, I get to experience these transformations, these, multiple manifestations of kindness and love and unity and solidarity. So I get to experience it. So I see things that give me hope and inspiration every day. And it's from our sort of fellow Americans, our fellow faith community leaders, our fellow community activists, and those on the ground, and just fellow human beings who are out there, who are choosing, again, this very different narrative than the one of hate and divisiveness and negativity that is often promoted. I get to see and experience those instances where people choose sort of the narrative of love over hate, of faith over fear. I see all of those on a regular basis. So I get a lot of hope and optimism coming from that. I also have to say that, I was speaking to a lot of different audiences, and I would always say that no matter how much negativity we might be seeing, even at sort of some of the heights of anti-Muslim sentiments in our country and the associated evil actions that we were seeing, I was telling people that it's an amazing time to be alive. And the reason I was saying that is because, and I truly believe this is still true right now for us, especially too, is that never in my lifetime have I felt that we have a greater opportunity to make a real difference in our country's future than we do today. Because everything that we are saying and doing, or our words and our actions or our inactions, it is directly determining history. Like we are writing history with those words and actions right now. So we have a powerful opportunity to really engage, especially given the power of social media and alternatives to some of the mainstream media sources that we've been limited by in the past. We have more power and possibility and privilege and opportunity to really make an impact right now. And that's what gives me hope and strength. And seeing all of these sort of coalitions building across our country, seeing all of the people active sort of on the streets, on building relationships, on wanting to engage, seeing all of this. And this is not just about one president or another. We are seeing a continuation of that. And that's what gives me hope and strength. And also, I have to add, seeing the youth. You know, the expression, the youth are the truth right now. Like, I feel like we're seeing that, seeing the different attitude and mindset and approach that a lot of the youth that I work with have to a lot of these issues. They're not sort of, you know, broken maybe in the same way that maybe some of our, you know, my generation or older generations have been by these problems of sort of racism in the very same way. Like, obviously racism continues and we're seeing its manifestations, but they have a very different attitude and perspective. And that also gives me hope and inspiration and allows me to continue. And the final piece I'll add is when we do this work, maybe this is a tip or advice that I would sort of put out there. When we do this work, one of the things that I'm constantly pushing is people have to do it in their own self-interest. It can't be this sort of notion of sort of the savior complex that I'm helping you or I'm saving you. We have to recognize how these issues are very much directly impacting ourselves as individual Americans and human beings, and our own well-being is directly connected to each other. Lila Watson, the indigenous Aboriginal woman, has this beautiful quote where she says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's sort of that powerful message of collective liberation that we really need to have in doing the work that we do. And when you have that sense of collective liberation, it's also a lot easier to be motivated by some of our own faith values that each one of our religious traditions teach us about faith, about unity, about helping those in need, helping each other, and uplifting ourselves as well in the process.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Anila, for that. Thank you, Reverend Cherry, for those reflections on hope. It's so important to remember that we can find and name that hope, and it's not just an abstract thing either. Neither of you were listing fantasies. You were talking about hope based on work that you've seen, that the human heart wants to emerge, the love wants to emerge, the peace wants to emerge, and we tend toward that. We can work toward that together. So thank you for that final word of hope. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've been introduced to the organization Paths to Understanding. We've had a time to welcome Aneelah Afzali and Reverend Kyllo, and we just affirm your great work that you're doing to build bridges of understanding and beloved community. I hope the Interfaith Works can be a part of the work that you're doing, and I look forward to ongoing collaborations with each of you. And one of the things I look forward to this summer is maybe hugs will be coming back. Maybe hugs are coming back someday soon, which is great. So we'll see you someday. We'll embrace as partners in peace together. And again, thank you for being here with us today. This has been an episode of Lean in Olympia. If you'd like to check out any of the past episodes, you can go to our Facebook page or YouTube channel or to our website and stay connected there. And our next episode of Lean in Olympia will be on March 23rd with Executive Director Meg Martin, who will be focusing on issues of homeless services, which is probably the biggest programmatic expression of Interfaith Works. So again, thanks to both of our guests today. It's been a joy to be with you, a true joy. Thanks to Cabin Light Media. And thank you for being here, all of you. Peace to you, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye now.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessings.